exceptionally important, and there is a lot to pricing. Let me put this out right here and now. Let me shut the door to the right, do it there. So pretty important, right? Gotta get this right. We want to stay with this, we have to get prices right. There is a plethora of historical examples of businesses that have done pricing wrong and in turn have essentially the bankrupt, right? So this is a key thing. Now, I'm going to put something out here which is critically important, and that's the whole book for paying attention to capture this. This is the key thing. Whenever, and this is a key foundational notion here, so you need to put it away. When we talk about pricing in marketing, fundamentally, pricing and the formulation of pricing strategy is an exercise in consumer psychology. Fundamentally, pricing is about consumer psychology. Okay, so it's fundamental that we recognize that, and that will be a basic theme throughout our treatment of pricing. And fundamentally, that is a core notion behind pricing as it relates to pure marketing applications. It is about consumer psychology. So that is key. Furthermore, we're going to be talking about some key things about pricing, which, by the way, there are a couple of things here that should not be new. Because when did we last talk about pricing? What? January. You're going to, as I am talking loudly, you are also going to have to reciprocate.
You learned about some pricing practices like body and pricing.
So when did we first, in this class, when did we first get introduced to notions of pricing?
First class.
Am I looking at? Yes, precisely, right? Absolutely, yes. Very good. During our video number 1, right?
Yeah.
Essentially. Together. Right, so what are some of the key points then that you can remember? You don't need to check notes or anything, because I just want to sort of tap into your emotion and bring your Right, okay, I get the point that you're making, and that is absolutely 100% correct. So you said it's more than figures. So the notion here then is that not only is pricing as a number, as a set price, critically important here, as we are saying, but as we are sort of applying here, the presentation of price, the way by which price is presented to the consumer is just as important, if not more important, than the actual price itself. I know. Let me see if I can mute that or something. Again. No. Okay. Even with that thing on the gate, right? Get back to what we were talking about before. Like he would have worked things. Right? Am I right there? Like I'm not at the left, right? Okay, so what was the point that I just made? What did I just say?
The way pricing is represented is as important as the price itself.
That's right, if not more important, yeah, and that makes sense, right? Why do I say that? Why do I say that? Think to our first video, our first
Setting
class
the,
together.
setting the reference price higher in mind with the
Consumers associate high price with quality.
Just price. I think that image of 2-3 prices or the taken is like set the reference price higher.
100%. Excellent. That's exactly right, right? So yeah, what are we saying here? We're basically saying that here, excuse me, as was rightfully said, I mean, the way that that price in that example was presented to the consumer was, it was presented as a discount.
Discount.
Off of a higher
High reference
price,
price.
whereby that initial price was presented to the consumer, and then the marketer subsequently discounted it to a lower price. So when we just look at that presentation, does that have an impact in the mind of the consumer? Big time, big time. So the consumer looks at that, and what do they think? They get a better deal, and importantly here, they recognize that their loss is minimized, and that's a good thing. That's pretty important. We'll talk more about that. Because as consumers, we hate losing stuff, right? Indeed, as humans, it's hardwired into us. As humans, that we hate losing things, right? And that's a key thing. So that is very important. So, like this example just illustrates this initial high price discount to a lower price, why is that so powerful? Why is it so pervasive and used all the time? We see it all the time. Why is that? Because it really taps into underpinning consumer psychology. Right? And we see it all the time. So, lest you doubt my point about pricing being fundamentally focused on consumer psychology, see the basic nature of what I'm just explaining here with regard to that example. So we see it all the time. So pricing is fundamentally about psychology. So we present pricing, this example then as what? As a discount off of a higher price. Right? And so the consumer looks at that and they think, okay, good. Getting a, as we say, good deal, that's a good thing. Potential loss of being minimized, that's a good thing. And there are a few sort of implied psychological aspects that are taking place also. We see the subsequent discounts, so that imparts in the consumer's mind a sort of an implied, or not explicitly stated, an implied sense of urgency. I better get it now before, that kind of thing.
The fear of missing out.
You see the subsequent, downward ladder in the pricing like that. You see then that it's, it's already gone through these things, so I'm really getting a good deal, So why don't we want to look at that final price? And why don't we take that final price as the final price, get rid of everything that I just said? Why don't we just get rid of all of the discounts and just simply keep it easy and give back to the consumer, show back to the consumer? Because it really would obliterate the psychological underpinnings that we were talking about. Conversely, why don't we just take a price and present that price as a premium off of a lower price? So you have $19.99 scratch, $29.99 scratch, $39.99 scratch, $69.99.
I think that would have the opposite effect.
Would have the opposite.
Yeah, the customer feel.
Absolutely. So generally speaking, absolutely, it would again defy the very psychological motions that we are suggesting here. So that is right, because what does that do in the mind of the consumer? That doesn't imply
Minimization of potential loss.
Loss. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
It implies a higher
Higher
loss,
loss.
right? And that's
Trigger.
bad. It goes against what is hardwired into us. So that is a key thing. Yeah, so that is key. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. I've mentioned loss here several times, and this being the basic thing that we have talked about, loss, right? So when we look at price, how, again, psychologically, how does the consumer sort of interpret a price like that? They interpret it as a loss, as an economic loss. That is how psychologically it impacts the consumer. So it is a psychological loss. Price represents a real or potential psychological loss. So that is a key thing to So, with those motivational kinds of points having established, having, established the importance and motivation for this topic, then let us jump into it in a little bit more detail and unpack it and understand it, right? So, as I always do, whenever we talk about an overall marketing strategy, what is it? That is it, as I always say. So fundamentally, we are at that very bottom foundational kind of 4P framework where we are going to be looking at P here, and specifically
Customer relationship.
Now, this is a key thing here, right? Because I will say it now, and I will repeat it later. When we have this piece of the statement right now. But when we talk about pricing, we must remember here another fundamental point, and that is that formulation of pricing strategy is something that is very carefully contrived, very deliberate, carefully thought through. It's not something we, think about for 10 minutes tonight, between Netflix shows and call it a day. Okay, it doesn't work that way. Right? It's a very deliberate, painstaking process of developing an appropriate pricing strategy. Key point here, and that is that, here's the point, pricing flows out of our overall marketing strategy. Okay? So in other words, when we formulate our overall marketing strategy, we've spoken all about these things, right, in the course so far, as we sort of one down the course, pricing flows out of all of those things, right? So everything has to be coordinated and synergized, right? So it flows out of our overall marketing strategy. Fundamental. So if we look at, say, the target market for a particular product, say, Rolex watches, right? Which, depending on the Rolex watch, basically the pricing would start at what, about $20,000 for a Rolex watch, roughly? So, let's say $30,000 for $35,000 for an average Rolex watch. Is Rolex going to all of a sudden, given its target market and given its overall strategy and position within the marketplace, you think they are going to say, "No, we're coming up with a new watch. Let's price it at $69.99." You think they'll do that? Absolutely not, because it flies in the face of their overall strategy.
Brand marketing strategy.
But that $69.99 might be quite appropriate for, say, Timex,
Yeah.
right? Which again is completely in sync with
Timex's
overall
marketing strategy.
right? So that is the key thing. So that's where we are. So more specifically then, we want to talk about some of the underlying psychological aspects so that we can understand how pricing works. And when we understand how pricing works, that then positions us and enables us to apply this pricing knowledge to a factoring context, a retail context, a potential warehousing context, a services context, goods selling context, a variety of contexts, because everything that we're about to talk about, knowledge that we have gained sort of allows us that flexibility to apply it to a variety of business contexts. And how do we do that? By understanding. So that's our So yeah, we'll talk about some of the competitor aspects and the critical elements associated with pricing. We'll talk about some essential terminology to help us understand how pricing works. Again, to help us understand pricing and the kind of thinking that we as humans, not AI, as humans, bring to bear on pricing. And we will talk towards the back end of a fundamental, might have touched on it in a video but a fundamental theoretical perspective that we typically do not find in textbooks. I always like to bring it to my class. Called prospect theory. This comes to us from our mother discipline of economics, and it really is intelligent, beautiful, exceptionally powerful theoretical perspective. And it helps us understand combinations of losses and gains. And that enables us to effectively present price to the consumer what is established. So that's our thinking there, and we'll talk about that. And we will talk a little bit again at the back end about some of the more important parts of what we do. So this is what we want to talk about. We recognize again the importance of price because price, true or false, is price intrinsically tied to value?
Yeah.
Yes or no? Big time.
Yes.
So what is value again? From a marketing perspective, we need to get this very, very firmly established in our mind, right? A little different from sort of a finance perspective or accounting perspective. Okay, what is value for us here and now? Moses, go.
Right.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Benefits over price. Benefits over price. That's what value is all about. Right? Benefits over price, that ratio, right? So if you have high benefits, low price, that is what higher low value.
High value.
High value.
High value.
Numerator big, denominator small, big number, high value, right? So we recognize that. So value is very important. Here, let me point out another foundational point also. How do we remember this kind of stuff, right? Well, one thing to remember is that, you know, in our course so far, whenever we talk about price, we recognize that price really occupies a very prominent spot in our relationships here. When we talk about price, it usually arithmetically occupies that denominator position. Price usually occupies that denominator position. And that's an important point to remember some of this stuff. And that becomes very important when you talk about price elasticity. What price elasticity is, we'll talk about that. Good. Right, so let's start talking a little bit more, having sort of established our conceptual foundation here, as well as our motivation. Let's jump into it and start unpacking this notion of pricing. To do that, we will start off conceptually, we will build our knowledge of price in a snowball. Okay, so when we talk about price, right off the bat, as I alluded to with the whole Rolex Timex example, we recognize that price absolutely is a fundamental signal to the consumer, right? What is it a signal for? It is a signal for prestige, for status, for desire, that is what price really conveys to the consumer right through your mind. Furthermore, it also is a signal, and this I'll say at least a few times, we also recognize that price is also an indicator, a signal for, this is one thing, quality, right? So, the whole notion, you get what you pay for it. People talk about that all the time, you get what you pay for it. Is that true? You agree with that or no? Yes or no? You get what you pay for it?
Usually.
High price gotta be high quality. Low price,
Usually.
low quality.
Not always.
Not always, but
That's the idea. That's probably always perceived as high potential value.
yeah. So whether it's true or not for our purposes here, doesn't really matter a whole lot right here and now as to whether that relationship is true or not. The bottom line, psychologically, is that it doesn't really matter because you know what? It is alive and well within the mind of the consumer. And the general consumer out there, through value processes. But the general consumer out there absolutely looks at that relationship and says, it's a high price, gotta be high quality, right? I'm gonna get this lawn cutting service, they charge a lot, it has to be quality, they don't like it, right? And it's a very laborious stuff behind the notion, right? I think I need some way to find myself in something. So yeah, it is very alluring, right? So, like I said, It doesn't really matter because it is a relationship that is alive and well in the mind of the consumer. While we're on this topic, what are we talking about here? When we look at this price-quality relationship, what about it? What about it? This is about it. It is a mental shortcut in the mind of the consumer. So in other words, the consumer sees that high price, low price, and they automatically think, what do they automatically think when they see that high price?
This product must deliver high quality.
High quality, right? And if they see low price, they think
This is
low quality.
low quality.
Right, generally. So we recognize that is what we call a mental shortcut, right? And there's a word, this is what every thing, but that is, there's a special name that we call a mental shortcut in consumer psychology. And that word is heuristic. It is a powerful heuristic. 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 It's a heuristic, very powerful. A mental shortcut. And that's the key thing. And psychologically, won't get into too much of it, but when we talk about this psychologically, humans, by by design, essentially, hardwired into the humans, we are continually seeking that, as we'd say, cognitive efficiency, right? Or more cynically, we can say we're always striving for that cognitive laziness. We're cognitively lazy, generally speaking, as humans. We can avoid thinking a lot. We're going to do it, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, some do this, some don't, but generally speaking, not so much. Right? So that's a key thing. So we are always searching for these mental shortcuts that very expensive like we principle. We'll talk more about that. So heuristic is a key thing. Furthermore, as we recognize that price is a signal, what else does price do for us? It also can be used as a basis for segmentation, right? Which is very important. Basis for segmentation. You will remember from our class number, whatever, 2 or 3. Segmentation is what segmentation is all about. Breaking down that mass market into identifiable groups. Right? It's a fundamental market. So it's about breaking down that mass market into identifiable groups, right? So the point that we're saying here is that price can absolutely be used as a basis for doing that. Let's look at Dollarama, Dollar Tree, Walmart to a large extent. Okay? Regarding price, what is the target market for Dollar Tree, Walmart? What is generally the target market price for the target market for these major retailers? What is it? I'll tell you what it is. They go after the target market. They go after guys like me who are highly price sensitive. People like me, we like to spend money, watch every penny. And that's part of it. It's not really very, very, underprivileged, family without any money, right? So I guess that's part of the thing. That has led to my price sensitivity, right? So watch every penny, right? So there are a number of reasons why. But anyway, at the end of the day, highly price sensitive. So I am the target market that Dollarama, Walmart, and some of these other value-oriented kinds of retailers are going after. So what are we saying? Price can be used as a means of segmentation in this regard. So yeah, there are definite psychological aspects associated with pricing, as I said, and it forms the basis of key marketing decisions, right? Pricing, so that is fundamental. Fundamentally, when we look at pricing also, it allows us, as we recognize, one of the pervasive themes here in this business course of marketing is that what do we want to do in business? What do we want to do? We want to make money, right?
Yeah.
We want to be like What's that?
Maximize profit.
Generally, yeah,
Right.
you know, I mean, a lot of people, you know, especially in the academic environment, they don't want, it sounds a little harsh and they don't want to say it. Well, I say, we want to make money, right? That's why we're in business, hopefully a lot of it,
Yep.
right? That's a fact of life, to be honest. So, yeah, we want to make, so therefore, we always look to, you know, the financial implications of every decision that we make. Whatever we do, there's always a financial implication, and so we always need to think of it that way. So therefore, when we look at price, broadly speaking, we can charge more to some consumers, right? We're talking conceptually. You can charge more to those consumers who are not price sensitive or price insensitive.
Sensitive.
Charge more to these people. We can charge more to those consumers who are more costly to serve. Northern Canada, you know, where you have to fly everything in, Yellowknife, and Northwest Territories. I mean, it is hard to serve these customers, right? Because you have to phone in and the whole thing, right? Costs a whole lot more to service those customers than it does customers in, say, Liberal or Ontario. So therefore, we need to charge more to those consumers. So we can charge more to those consumers who are cost consumers. Charge more to those consumers who are price insensitive. And importantly, we can charge more to those consumers who are poorly served by the competition. So if we can offer something that the competition is not, guess what? We can charge more jobs. So these are some of the interpretations associated with that. So yeah, there are a lot of influencing aspects and tactics then that we can employ, that we'll talk about, that helps us to affect some of these things. So, I'm sure I have this here. So when we talk about, you know, some of the more tactical aspects associated with pricing, there are quite a few kind of tactical aspects that we can sort of employ here. And there are a whole bunch of them. Let me just cite a few. One is what we call product bundling. Product bundling. We will talk more about product bundling, price bundling later, in fact. But when we talk about product bundling and price bundling, what is that all about? Well, you know what? Whenever you walk into a Costco, you see it. When you walk into a Costco, generally speaking, you can't just buy one tube of toothpaste, right?
Yeah.
You can't just buy one muffin.
You gotta buy it back.
You have to buy whatever came,
Yeah.
12 months, whatever it is. You can't just buy one tube of toothpaste. You have to buy a bundle, right, of what, 3 or 4, whatever, tubes of toothpaste, right? So the notion here, from a pricing perspective, is that the bundled final price is lower than the price, the summation of the price of the individual items, generally speaking. Thus, it saves the consumer money, right? So that's the notion behind product bundling and price bundling, as we will talk about. Another sort of tactic is what we call metering. So metering simply is the association between price and consumption. So in other words, you know, internet usage, you know, phone usage sometimes, et cetera, et cetera. Price is linked to consumption. So in other words, if you, you know, are, I always like to give this example. You might see this in some places if you have to. You know, if we are leasing a photocopier, we can lease it for $2,000 a month, right? And for that $2,000 a month leasing agreement, we are entitled to make 0 to say 10,000 photocopies. If we make 10,000 to 20,000 copies, the price on a monthly basis will go up. If we make 40 to 50,000, the price will go up again. Why is that? Because consumption is metered, it's monitored, and pricing works on consumption in that regard. So that's what metering is all about. furthermore, we also have this notion that's quite prevalent, and that is what we call tie-ins. A tie-in. So in other words, getting back to this example, what do we need if we have a photocopier? What do we need?
Ink.
On a daily, regular basis, we need
Paper,
we
ink,
need
ink, yeah, paper.
right? So then, the company then, from whom we are leasing said machine, they can provide us a deal on paper supply. They can tie in paper at a cost
Complementary
for us.
products,
They can
okay.
also tie in ink for us at a cost, right? So there are tie-ins like that, right? We buy a new vehicle, we can, on the service side, we can purchase an extended warranty, you know? That's essentially a potential tie-in also, but, et cetera, et cetera. So tie-ins and that kind of thing. What else? Yeah, so those are some of the tactics that are involved. We also have some other tactics too that we see that are quite common, and that is like time of purchase. Does time have an effect on price?
Yes.
Can time have an effect? Big time, usually.
Usually during September, winter jackets, usually it's not much expensive when it's getting closer to.
Valid point, not what I was thinking, but that's exactly right, Moses. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are end of season sales and that kind of a thing. If you want to follow on your example, I mean, typically at some retailers, if you want to buy a winter jacket, you know, chances are, you know, during the change of season or in the summer, you will probably pay less for that seasonal item than you would at the start of that season, right? So absolutely. So timing in that regard has an effect. Also, guess what? If we go to see a movie on Tuesday night, are we gonna pay more or less than if we go on, say, on Saturday night?
Less.
Big time, right? Why is that? Because of the pricing difference, right? So yeah, we can pay less, right? So time has a huge impact on that regard. And by the way, we talk about that a lot of my fourth year undergrad service marketing course too. So just a comment on that, you know, in service marketing, one of the major challenges in services is to coordinate supply with demand. It's a major challenge, right? Just look at the airline industry, right? Because we have a lot of, you know, consumers who are wanting to fly from ATW or Detroit, ATW to LAX, right? Say in 2 weeks' time. We have a lot, if there's an influx of people, you know, it's just not that easy to just lay on another jet. You just can't do it. So therefore, especially in the airline, transportation, hotel, when supply is very, very carefully controlled, the service provider, the marketer, has to be very, very carefully synchronize potential demand with supply. And to do that, there are a number of levers that can be used in order to manipulate demand. Price is a major lever that can be used for that purpose. So, you know, again, like, you know, a few days ago, I'll give you a personal example. Let's see, I'm going to a conference in Washington, D.C. at the end of July. Right? So last week, it was like a 4 months of events. Last week, I made the airline booking, right? I made the airline booking, and it was costing me taxi from Detroit to PW. It was costing me $280 return to Washington. So it's another $200. Did you? Huh? What? Good question. Canadian dollars. Yeah, Canadian dollars. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So the point here is that, yeah, I mean, how to get it, but although it was, but the point here is that the airline then, based on a monitoring of demand, and their pricing algorithm sets that price accordingly. So in other words, 2 days before the flight, if there are seats available, the person, sitting next to me might pay, double or triple or quadruple that. Right? So that is a key thing. And by the way, what do we call that? What do we call that fluctuation pricing effect? We see it a lot in transportation, airlines, absolutely. We see it a lot in hotel accommodation and that kind of thing. That is what we call dynamic pricing. And the dynamic pricing model, primarily facilitated by technology, using very sophisticated algorithmic approaches, essentially monitors the overall demand. And in relation to available supply, the algorithm will raise or lower price in response to those changes. So again, it's another way of maximizing profitability, so to speak, using that dynamic pricing model. So, pricing is very, very sophisticated. So that is the key thing, right? So, as we sort of start to unpack pricing in a little bit more detail, it bears, in this case, repetition yet again, that, when we talk about pricing, formulation of pricing strategy, it flows out of our overall marketing strategy. That's a key thing. I've already said that. So yeah, when we get involved in targeting decisions, the pricing that we are charging to different people, we recognize things here. We recognize that we essentially, in many instances, are charging different prices to different consumers for the same product. When you go to a basics on whatever it is, piece of paper or pencil, you can enjoy a student discount of 10%, or you have a student discount rate, or say this in some instances. Some of us can enjoy a senior's discount too. Right? But anyways, what essentially is happening here, through these offerings, essentially is what we call price discrimination. Price discrimination. So again, what is price discrimination? Price discrimination is where we charge different prices to different consumers or different consumer segments for the same product. Right? And that's what we call price discrimination. Now, as we continue to conceptually get a better and better sort of understanding of pricing and its nuances, we want to think about this. Getting back to what I said before, there are some attributes that are integrally linked to perceived attributes that are linked to price. One of which is, what did I say? Quality. So let's explore that in a little bit more detail. You recognize then that consumers for various brands within a product category, have different varied perceptions of quality related to different brands, right?
Yeah.
Brand A is perceived as being this level of quality, brand W has this level of quality. Okay, so we have two things that are going on. Price and perceived quality, right? That's going on. So if we sort of start thinking about it that way, brands, quality, and price, what are we talking? We have three variables that are sort of on the table here, right? Different brands, different levels of quality, and different price points. Right? So we have things that are happening here. So let me say, okay, well, how can we sort of think this through in a little bit more detail vis-a-vis price? When we start looking at it, we think this way. We say, okay, if we look at a fundamental attribute such as perceived quality, we recognize then that generally the consumer will look at that level of perceived quality and think about some key brands within the overall product category. And if they think about another level of quality, they'll think of other brands. They'll rate other brands at another level of quality. Okay, so we have different levels of perceived quality and a clustering effect of brands at each one of those levels of quality. Now, as you seek to understand it, we can superimpose that third variable onto this whole thing. What was the third variable that I did not mention? Price. Price. Right? So consistent with everything that I've said so far, then, if we look at that high level of perceived quality and the cluster brands that exist there, how would that work in terms of pricing? Low or high price?
High price.
High quality,
High price.
set of brands at high quality, would that be high price?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, it'd be high
High
price.
price.
So therefore, as we apply this kind of thinking, it allows us then to think about another notion in pricing from a strategic perspective, and that's what we call pricing bands. Price bands or price tiers. So what does that look like? Here's an example. Let's do some examples. Okay, where we look at it this way. It helps us, it's a foundational, our thinking at this point is foundational. Like we're starting to think more and more about pricing, how pricing sort of works overall in relation to a bunch of other things, right? That's what we're doing now. So when we look at this, we see, okay, we see for the ice cream product category, we see, 4 levels of perceived quality here, ranging from, top to bottom, right? Excellent to fair. Furthermore, as I just said, at each one of those levels, where we see a clustering effect of brands that the consumer will conceive to be in that level of perceived quality. Now, when we superimpose price, we see that these tend to cluster around that price point, and so on and so forth. And so what are we saying here? We have the emergence of what we call a pricing tier or a price band. Right? So when we look at this, it helps us to better understand pricing and the role of pricing. Now, as we recognize that, at this point now, in order to better understand price, we need to understand some fundamental things here now. Now we start getting involved in some of the more concrete thinking in terms of marketing. And that is, there's several fundamental questions, but a fundamental question that we as marketers ask is, okay, we want to sell these products. This is who we want to target. What do you think the most consistent with our overall approach of trying to maximize the profits? What's the most that we can charge? What's the most the market will bear? Isn't that a valuable question for us to ask as business people? Sure.
Yes.
What's the most we can? So in marketing and in economics, there are terms that we use technically to capture this notion, and this is very important. Well, I said everything else. So we then introduce this notion that we call perceived value and or customer value and or reservation price. And though there are nuanced differences between the two, for our purposes right here and now, these 3 terms mean the same thing. Okay, so again, words matter, words have a big impact, so therefore, we're very, very cautious about our terminology and our word usage here. So when we talk about these 3 terms, they mean one key thing for us right here and now, and that is this. What is the maximum the consumer is willing to pay for it? What is the maximum the consumer is willing to pay? That is captured by the notion of perceived value, customer value, and or as economists like to say, reservation price. Okay, the maximum amount. So let's take an example. Here we have a Tim Hortons extra large coffee. I just bought it, I forget how much I paid for it. This was sell the line. I think it was like $2.40 or something. Hey? $2.49? Hey? Was it $2.49 that I paid? $2.45. Right? Yeah. So the last one we bought was $2.30. A long time ago, so I sell the line. Are you a $2.40? That's how you know. You work downstairs or?
No, it's a grandmother.
Oh, okay, so you work, how long have you been there?
10 months.
How long?
10 months.
Oh, yeah, I'm just here. So far, so good. Hard work, though, huh? Very busy, huh? What's your, do you like the drive-in or the counter? So, okay, so let's say, what was it, 249 was it?
245.
245. So 245. So what is that? What did I just say? What did you just say? The price on this is what, say it again? That's the price. That's how much I paid for it. However, and don't tell Tim Hortons, don't tell Tim this, okay? It's just me giving me promise. See? There, that, the maximum amount that I would be willing to pay for that is $3. Don't tell anybody about this. Because if they find out, they're going to price it up. I don't want that. Okay? So what is the, what did I say? The maximum amount that I'm willing to pay for this is what? And what do we call the maximum amount that I'm willing to pay for this? Yeah, everybody read it. I want to hear everybody read that slide. Everybody read it. Right. And so what does that mean? Everybody's saying those three terms capture what question?
What is the maximum the customer is willing to pay?
The maximum amount the consumer is going to pay. Okay, so getting back to this example, the maximum amount that I'm willing to pay, in other words, my perceived value for this, or my reservation price for this item is $3. The price is $2.45. Is that good? Is that good for me as a consumer?
Yeah.
Do I perceive that as being a bargain? Yes, I do. Am I happy with that? Yes, I do. Will I buy it? Absolutely. If the price is less than the maximum, I'm going to pay. Sure, I'm going to buy it, of course. Right? So it's all good from the consumer's perspective. Let's say, for example, let's consider another sort of follow-on example. Let's say I go to, this is kind of true too, that's why I never go. Quite sensitive, right? That's why I never go to a Starbucks, right? So let's say the same quantity of coffee, that extra large, how much am I going to pay at a Starbucks for basically the same kind of regular coffee? $7. Let's say $7 before I get some, okay? $7. Are you kidding me? Are you really kidding me? No. $7. That's why this guy never goes $7. No disrespect to anybody who does. It's all great. Lots of people do it. It's all wonderful. Me, no way. Anyway. So, what is the price at Tim Hortons? So at this point, what is the price for that item? Starbucks. How much is it at Starbucks? Right. But my perceived value here essentially hasn't really changed. So what is my perceived value? So here then we have a situation where the maximum amount, the reservation price is greater than the price. Am I going to buy it? Absolutely not. Because it exceeds, the price exceeds the maximum that I'm willing to pay. So am I going to buy it? No, I will not. However, there is one major economic condition that would apply that would compel me to buy it, or would it facilitate my buying it, and that is if there is an economic condition of monopoly that exists. So if that is the only place where I can get said coffee, I probably would buy it, notwithstanding the fact that the price does exceed my perceived value. And that happens too, right? You're in a particular location, you know, there are no cheaper beans around, there is Starbucks, so you sort of bite the bullet, say, okay, I'm gonna get ripped off. Okay, fine. Right? So it's the only macro, not that micro, at a microeconomic level, it's the only show in town. But generally speaking, the consumer is not looking to buy it. So, therefore, what are we saying here? There are three sort of relational conditions then that emerge along this line of thinking, and they are indicated here. Again, by way of review, we have a situation where, the Tim Hortons example, the perceived value is greater than the price, which of course is greater than the cost. Sure, of course. Okay, what's the cost here associated with this for Tim Hortons?
82 cents.
So, what is the cost associated with, well, it's a big question, we'll talk more about that. The question though is, what do we include in this? Do we include all overhead? Do we include R&D? Do we include R&D? Do we include only the cost of goods sold? Well, I would suggest that, you know, the cost of coffee that is sitting in this cup for Tim Hortons, just a guess, probably doesn't cost more than about 5 or 10 cents. I would suggest. Yeah, the coffee is, I would, in fact, I would even argue the cost of the cup and the sleeve and the thing probably costs more than the actual coffee that's in it. Probably. I don't know that. Right? So the point is that the price is larger than the cost. So we have that first condition, and what did we say? That first condition is perceived as a bargain for the consumer. So the consumer's going to buy it quite happily, right? Now, from a business perspective, what is one of the words of caution that we need to throw out here under that first condition? It might result in an inventory replenishment, depletion. In other words, as consumers perceive this, they will typically buy more. So we need to be very mindful of our ability to supply and inventory production. It's good that we need to be very cautious about that. Conversely, when we look at that second condition, the Starbucks kind of condition here, yeah, the consumer typically will not buy it unless that monopoly condition exists. So that's not a very healthy situation either, generally speaking. And then, of course, we have a third condition that arises, which is quite extreme, and that is where we have the price, which is certainly greater than the cost, which is way bigger than the maximum that the consumer can pay. And so what do we call that condition? We call that condition A. Are you ready? Rip off. In fact, we can say a freaky rip-off. It's a freaky rip-off. Right? It is a rip-off. So is the consumer going to buy? No, absolutely not. They're not going to buy there because they feel that they are being ripped off. And that absolutely will spell failure. When that fails, what does that usually mean? It means that usually the product will have to be withdrawn and they will have to be used. So that is the exact situation. Okay, three kinds of situations. So, as we think about this then, we recognize another fundamental question in marketing here. And this is a pervasive theme that runs throughout everything we're talking about here today. We've spoken about the maximum amount the consumer is willing to pay, 3 terms for that. Then the fundamental question, which is underpinning essentially everything we're talking about, is, as marketers, let's listen to people, and this is something that is, this is a lesson with all the time. Where do we set the price? Where do we set the price? Fundamental question. Where do we set the price? So in order to help us understand that, I'd like to sort of introduce my students. Typically, you don't see this textbooks either. I like to sort of describe for my students a graphic that I like to call the strategic price gap. And the strategic price gap essentially is depicted like this. It's a simple kind of a thing. It's just basically 4 words here, that's all it is. And all we're saying is that we have a ceiling and we have a floor, and somewhere between that ceiling and that floor, we want to set a price. And this sort of graphically illustrates it. So when we set our price, consistent with everything we're talking about, what about it? We want to set our price lower than the maximum that the consumer is willing to pay for it, but higher than the cost. Right? I mean, if we set our price lower than the cost, what does that mean? I mean, we're losing money to go over. There are times that we can, our pricing tactics employed, where we are, absorbing, small margin losses with loss leaders. But generally speaking, we do not want to price lower than our cost, generally speaking. Right? As a rule. So the question then becomes is, like I said, where do we set our price? In other words, where in the strategic pricing gap do we set our price? Ultimately stated, how much of that strategic pricing gap do we capture as profit for ourselves versus lower and releasing it more to other channel members, right? And that is the key thing. Largely, it's a function of individual elasticities. We can talk about that momentarily. So, where in the strategic pricing gap do we set our price? Well, as we explore that notion, we have some options that are available to us. We can, as we say, price to value. Price to value. What does price to value mean? Well, essentially, we mean that we are setting our price here. Pricing to value essentially means that we are setting our price at our reservation price, at the ceiling. In other words, we are maximizing our potential profit here. Is that an option? Sure, it's an option. We may or may not want it. It depends on our overall strategic orientation here. But yeah, is it an option? Sure it is. Absolutely, it's an option. So, pricing to value is an option. But fundamentally, I make this argument, and that is that whenever we talk about pricing and setting a price, it is very much a managerial decision to make, right? Generally speaking, whether it's directly, managers, marketers will look at things and, based on experience and knowledge and everything else, set prices, or whether they design an algorithm that allows those kind of constraints to be technically developed, either way, whether it's direct or indirect, it's fundamentally a human decision. It's very much a managerial decision. Furthermore, this then allows us to recognize another fundamental question here in marketing. Okay, so what's our pervasive theme here? The pervasive theme is, where do we set the price? We recognize so far that we look at several things. One is the maximum amount the consumer is willing to pay. Where do we set our price? Here, now, we talk about another fundamental question that we need to think about here. And that is, if we change our price, what will be the effect on quantity demanded in relation to changing price? Right? We set our price, what effect will it have on quantity demanded? So right off the bat, what are we doing now? We're sort of introducing more of an economic perspective into this whole discussion that we're having. So, the economic notion that captures that question is what we call price elasticity. More specifically, price elasticity of demand. So, price elasticity of demand addresses the question, what will be the change in quantity demanded in response to a change in price? That's what price elasticity of demand is. So when we look at it that way, like I said, we are concerned then, how will a change of price affect the quantity demanded? And to address that, we examine the notion of price elasticity of demand. And when we talk about price elasticity of demand, it is fundamentally premised on basic economic theory of supply and demand, which essentially suggests that there absolutely is a relationship between price and quantity. And when we look at demand on the demand side versus the supply side, let me ask you this, what is the relationship between quantity demand and as we look at price and quantity demand? What's the relationship? Very good.
Inverse relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely inverse. So in other words, when one goes up, the other one goes, absolutely right, yeah, absolutely. Not so much for supply, but we're not worried about supply right now. So, we will look at that momentarily. And why is that important? Why is that important? Well, it's important because it's essential in our overall understanding and establishment of pricing. But it's also important for another reason, because when we look at elasticity like this, it allows us to introduce and understand yet another very prominent and powerful concept in the market. And that is the notion of substitutability. So, Coke, can I substitute Pepsi for Coke? Yeah, sure. Or another cola for Coke? Sure. Can I substitute, another barber for my? Sure. Can I substitute one lawn cutting guy for another? Sure. Substitute. Can I substitute one tube of toothpaste for another? Sure. Can I substitute one laptop computer for another? Can I substitute which I always do? How about something like gasoline? Can I substitute another commodity for gasoline? No. I can't put anything else in my internal combustion engine other than gasoline. Can we substitute another, and I'm not speaking about sustainable fuels and some of these type of things that are under development now, by the way, which I'm just so we're not talking about that, but generally speaking, at this time, can we really substitute another jet fuel, kerosene, avgas kind of compound for jet fuel? The answer is no, not really. Like there are some that are being developed right now, some other kinds of fuels, but generally speaking, we can't. How about natural gas? Can we substitute something else for natural gas? The answer is no. So these are not substituted. So the point here is that substitutability is important in the market as a direct impact on pricing. Substitutability, right? And quantity demand. Can you substitute or not? That's a key thing. So let us explore that in a little bit more detail when we look at price elasticity. Now, price elasticity by arithmetic definition is defined as this. We're looking at the change in quantity demanded in relation to a change in price. So again, here I circle back to that little trick that I told you about earlier, right? Where is price located in this little ratio? Okay? Well, denominator. Okay, so you're in the final exam, you're thinking through some of this stuff, as you will be, because I'm giving you the scenarios that folks through a little bit. You will remember. Oh, yes. Your little professor, you told me. How do I remember? Because price is in the denominator. Right? That's remember, right? Am I right? Emphasize that you're looking for, right? Is that right? So that is kind of the key here. So let's talk about price elasticity then in a little bit more detail, and let us physically together sketch it out. Shall we? You want to physically sketch it out. And as normal, that blackboard won't stay up. Trying to talk about here like this, so yeah, as normal. So here I will assume that everybody can see it. If you cannot see what I'm writing, copy. Can everybody see this? Okay, so what do we have here? So what is, let's say, price, quantity,
Quantity.
and what did we say, basic economic theory of supply and demand essentially suggests that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So as we've already said, that is what it looks like. And of course, we have to apply. Now, when we look at the whole notion of the economic notion of elasticity here, we can sketch it out based on basic economic theory of supply and demand. And when we sketch it out here, it's easier for us to understand this when we look at two extreme cases. And the two extreme cases we want to look at are what we call perfect inelasticity and perfect elasticity. These are two extreme cases, right? High elasticity and, shall we say, low elasticity, or ultimately stated, high inelasticity. Are you with me here? So we look at these two. So let's look at the first scenario first. What was the first one? Perfect inelasticity. Perfect inelasticity. What does that look like? Generally, when we talk about perfect inelasticity, we are thinking of a vertical demand curve. Okay? So, you know, in reality, it's almost vertical, but in reality, the extreme case is that it is a very steeply negatively slow curve. So it looks like something like that. That's what it looks like. So let's lay this out then. Okay, change in price. We're interested in the change, the impact on quantity demanded in response to a change in price. Okay, so let's play this out. We have an initial price, let's call it price 1. And in response to price 1, we have a corresponding quantity demanded, let's call it P1. Now, we are changing our price from the original P1 to another price, let's call it P2. So what do we have to do here? P2. And P2, our next price, corresponds to, call it Q2. So, what do we see here then? We see that we have a change in price, which is what relatively here, conceptually, it is what we can call big. It's big in relation to that. It's big. As compared to what do we have here? Change in quantity demanded, which is relatively. So, according to price elasticity as defined, what do we have? We have a situation where we have the elasticity is what? Change in quantity demanded, which is small, over change in price, denominator, change in price, which is, whenever we have a numerator which is smaller than the denominator, that basically means 1 is less than 1, which means highly inelastic, or elasticity is very low, elasticity is lower than 1. And that's what we have. Are you with me here? So now we can look at the opposite. The opposite. What do we have? The opposite extreme case. What did we say? It was perfect elasticity. Right? And when we talk about perfect elasticity, the curve here, we can think of it essentially as being the demand curve here is essentially horizontal. However, it's just a very shallow slope schematic. So it looks kind of like this. So what do we have here? Here now, we go through that same thinking again. What do we have? We have an initial price called one, and that corresponds to quantity demanded, call it Q1. We change the price, and that corresponds to a quantity demanded of Q2. And so what do we have here now as we look at that kind of effective relationship? What do we see? We see a change in price, which here, relative to all of this going on, is small. And correspondingly, what do we have here? We have a change in quantity demanded, change in quantity, which is, so therefore, what do we have here? We have our elasticity is big over small, which means that elasticity is greater, is greater than one, right? Where we have a large numerator, small denominator, greater than one, which means highly elastic, right? And that is the thinking that we bring to bear there. So, getting back to what I said before, when we recognize that then, is everybody with me here so far? But anyway, that's the kind of thing you want to remember to do, right? As we just walk you all through this, right? So on final exam, when I'm asking questions along these lines, that's the kind of thinking you bring to bear, okay? It's that relational kind of thinking. So, when we look at it that way, well, let me ask the question. What are some commodities that would be characteristic of those relationships? Why is that happening? What in the marketplace would exist whereby we have a big change of price and essentially a negligible change of quantity demand? Something like gasoline, oil, natural gas. That is those commodities that are not substitutable. So when we talk about substitutability, you know, for highly inelastic commodities, you know, they generally are not substitutable. You can't substitute something else for gasoline in your car. So therefore, it is very low elasticity, i.e. high inelasticity. Conversely, if we look at something like, getting back to what I said before, our tubes of toothpaste, our bottled water, you know, et cetera, these commodities are what? Highly substitutable, right? Coke, you know, where we have that little change in price and results in a big change in quantity in that. Coke boosts their price, you know, 10 cents for a bottle of Coke, and guess what the Coke bars are going to do? They're going to flip to something else substitute, like your Pepsi or whatever, right? Why? Time substitute. So high elasticity, highly substitutable, right? Why is there high elasticity? Because these commodities are highly substitutable. So this therefore gives us insight as to how to deal with quantity changing, quantity demand changes in relation to changes in price. So very simple, but a very, very powerful concept here, elasticities. So we like that. Now, let us take a 10-minute break at this point, and we will reconvene and we will talk about the role of costs. So 2:30, please bring up your costs, how can we
Second half.
understand the role of costs? Well, the best way, generally speaking, to think of costs and the role of costs is to think of it as a whole in our overall pricing strategy, right? In other words, like I said, we do not generally do not want to price lower than the cost for the reasons that we just mentioned. And so therefore, when we look at the role of costs, it is somewhat problematic, you know, when we look at the role of costs. In other words, the question is pervasive, and that is, what do we include in costs? And that's a nebulous scope. There are a lot of things that we can include in costs. If we're big pharma, for example, and we are spending literally years and billions of dollars developing advanced medications, you know, do we include R&D in our costs?
Yes.
Huge, right? It's a huge component of our overall cost. Getting back to Tim Hortons, should we include as R&D a key consideration in our coffee shop costs? No,
Some.
of course not. No. So this is the kind of thing we bring to bear. What do we include? We include cost of goods sold. Well, for Tim Hortons, what do we include in cost of goods sold? Sorry, what do we include in cost? Do we include only cost of goods sold? Do we include R&D? What do we include is the point here. The thing is, though, is that if we look at costs, if we rely solely on costs, that can be problematic also. And the main reason why, I will say it now, and I'll say it again probably later on, is that if we rely solely on costs, in other words, if we establish our baseline costs as being whatever, and we say, okay, well, whatever, we're just going to add on, 15% more over our cost, or 20% over our cost, that's a viable option too. But the problem with that is that it fundamentally ignores psychology. It ignores the very important notion that we are suggesting here, right? The consumer psychological aspect, and that is a problematic thing. So we need to be very cautious about that. Yes, consider it absolutely, but be very, very cautious and systematic and deliberate as to how we account for cost, in other words. And further, adding to the complexity of using costs is that there are many commodities that are fundamentally, the costs of which are fundamentally driven by volume, right? In other words, there are those commodities that are highly scalable, as we say, that are highly subject to economies of scale, whereby essentially economies of scale, the more you produce, the lower the per item cost goes, right? And for those commodities, if you're producing more, your cost is lower. So therefore, you can't really base it purely on cost, right? And the reverse is true too. If you look at the beer industry, for example, the beer industry is very, very subject to the scale effect, right? The more you produce of beer, the lower the per liter, per unit cost of is for beer. Because in the beer industry, for example, you have a high fixed cost, but the variable cost is pretty low for beer. I mean, when you're talking about beer production, what is the variable cost here essentially? Water, a bit of yeast, some hops, and that's pretty well it, right? So most of the cost, the total cost in beer production is captured by fixed cost. And again, when you're producing higher quantity, what happens is that fixed cost is spread over more units, thus bringing the per item cost, total cost down, generally speaking. And those are scale effects. Is that clear? Do you guys know this, by the way? You're 4 years on the cusp. You should know this, right?
Economies of
Economies of
scale.
scale, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, pretty basic. So that is key. So therefore, that's the kind of thinking that we bring to bear. At the end of the day, simply put, I mean, I just bring out this slide simply to make the point that, you know, when we talk about that fundamental, addressing that fundamental question of marketing, how should we set the price? Where should the price be? I made the point that it is fundamentally a managerial human decision process to make. And so therefore, there are a lot of things, some of which are indicated here, that the manager has to consider in the establishment of price. Not the least of which is, we look at, you know, what stage is the product in, the product life cycle, right? What is the product life cycle again, anyone? Product life cycle, what is that?
The full,
Who am I looking at here? I just see a whole lot of mumbling. I hear a lot of mumbling, where should I look at? Okay,
From production to the customer,
production to the customer,
to the consumer.
process of the product going from production stage to the market, like to the end user stage. I think the whole thing is the product life cycle.
From the wholesaler, retailer,
Maturity stage,
Introduction, growth,
decline,
Moses.
okay, maturity stage, decline,
Ah.
stage, and then the introduction,
introduction, maturity,
introduction, maturity.
and decline.
Now we're getting it. Yes. Now I'm getting now I will be able to sleep better tonight. Yes, thank you. So what are we saying here? We're saying, you're absolutely right. So that's what we're saying, right? Product life cycle essentially is a superimposition on a product of our human-like, stages of life. And so what do we have? As you rightfully said, we have introduction, we have growth, we have maturity, and we have decline, just like a human life, right? And so accordingly, from a marketing perspective, at each one of those four major stages, generally, we seek to do different things from a marketing perspective at each one of those major stages, generally speaking. So there's a primary overriding marketing objective generally at each one of those major stages, right? And with a supporting 4P framework to support each one of those stages. So, for example, a product introduction, there are a bunch of things that we do different at product introduction from the things that we would do at, say, decline, right? That's the kind of thing. And that has pricing implications, right? We won't get into more detail at this point regarding that. You can read it in the book. The textbook does a good job, by the way, of discussing product life cycle. So if you haven't seen it, I guess you will momentarily. So there are other things too, right? Like there's pricing objectives. Here we're talking about penetration, tactical aspects, penetration, and skimming. We'll talk about those momentarily. So we can do a bunch of things there. There are industry conditions also that exist within the marketplace, right? Within the industry. And those are captured by those 5 major points here. Now that should ring a bell for you also, right? What are those 5 points? Absolutely right. The work of Michael Porter out of Harvard. Exactly right. Porter 5-force model, right? Which together serves to frame and allow us to understand how competition and churning works within the industry, right? So yeah, we have that. That has a whole impact on pricing. We have various psychological aspects we'll talk about too, but like I said, at the end of the day, it is that managerial decision-making capacity that really determines pricing, right? In recognition of this and a whole lot of other things, right? So that is a key thing. So when we talk about setting the price, again, it is about how much of that strategic pricing gap do we want to capture for ourselves as profit. So accordingly, there are some tactical ways that we can address this. First of all, in marketing, we often talk about this notion of what we call penetration pricing and compare it to what we call skimming. Two extreme cases. When we talk about penetration as a pricing tactic, what is that? Penetration is about what? Pricing low. Skimming is about pricing right. So we have these two extreme cases. Okay, let's talk about penetration then. When might penetration as a tactic be what we would be looking for here? When would it be a viable option? I'll tell you when. We would lean more towards a penetration kind of tactic when we want to rapidly build up market share, right? Price low, people will buy it, build up market share, right? Consistent with basic economic theory of supply and demand. So it's viable when we want to rapidly build up market share. If that is a concern for us, pricing might be the way to go. Furthermore, it would not be a viable option for those commodities that are characterized by the price-quality relationship, right? So not all commodities are characterized by that. However, for those commodities that are absolutely characterized by that relationship, you don't want to price low, right? So if you're bringing out a new Rolex watch, you don't want to price it at, $175, okay? You don't want to do that, right? For all the reasons that we have spoken about before. So that is a key thing, right? So, when we, what else did I want to say about penetration? Another thing. When we talk about penetration, what do we say? It's about pricing low. So if we price low, what about that? I said it has an impact on quantity demanded. As a result, market share to be rapidly built. And so what does that mean from a competitive perspective? That means then that by following, at least initially, a strategy or a tactic of penetration, it leaves, here's the point, it leaves little room left for the competition. Because we've already built up our market share. There's not much left for the competition, right? So it can be used in that case. Furthermore, why is that the case? It's not attractive to the competition. Why? Because the competition will also see a lower price. They will think lower margins. It's not very attractive and lucrative for competition to jump into it, so they will leave it alone, generally speaking, right, for those reasons. So it has an impact there. So penetration, a viable option, and we can use it if it fits. It absolutely gives the consumer the most value, right? Price is low, value goes up, so it enhances value. And like I said, it is a very strong choice to use when you can capitalize on the scale effect, like I said, right? Penetration. You can price low, and in turn, you price low, and the more you produce it, the lower the cost goes. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Pricing low, so your margin can be attractive in that regard. But here's another problem also with pricing low, and that is, here's the point, it limits and reduces your flexibility. Because from a marketing perspective, it's a psychological in nature, if we price low, it's always more challenging to raise the price later, right? It's always challenging to raise prices, generally speaking. So we need to be cautious about that. So it limits our flexibility moving forward. Now, there are ways, as we will talk about probably next class, I think, there are ways around that, right? So if we do need to impose a price increase, there are ways that we can do it. In other words, probably we could raise the price and superimpose a couponing program at the same time to sort of mitigate that impact of the price increase, right, for a period of time. That's something that we could think about doing. But at any rate, bottom line, the key point here, penetration, it does limit our flexibility moving forward, right? So that's a key thing. Furthermore, and I'll say it now, and I'll keep on saying it, we're pricing low. We always have to be highly aware and mindful of this thing. Whenever we engage in pricing or any price change, we never ever want to change the price, amend the price, impose a price without thinking about the potential impact on that most sacred thing in marketing, the
Brand equity.
right, the brand, right? Like I said, we never want to do it. Do you think Rolex is going to come up with a 40% sale next week? No, right? Timex, maybe. Rolex, absolutely not. So, it's all about the brand and the expectation. So we need to be very cautious about that. So we always have to recognize that. Expectations are a very, very powerful thing in terms of our overall human functioning, and especially as it relates to marketing. Okay, skimming. Skimming, if penetration is pricing low, skimming is what?
Pricing high.
Pricing high, right? And so here, when we talk about skimming and we're pricing high, essentially we are capturing the maximum amount of our strategic pricing cap as profit, essentially gross profit for ourselves. So absolutely, pricing high is an appropriate option if we are really operating with that commodity that is characterized by that price-quality relationship, right? The Rolex pricing, for example, the Lamborghini pricing, right? So yeah, we can price high in that regard, you know, when it is characterized by those relationships, right? It also is quite appropriate when there is a little chance of future competition. It's quite appropriate too. In other words, if you look at Big Pharma, you know, as Big Pharma, we introduce a new medication, advanced, sophisticated medication into the marketplace. Well, guess what? When we do that, we can enjoy about 8 to 14 years or so of patent protection in the marketplace. In other words, we don't have to worry about a competitor taking our drug, reverse engineering it, and then, you know, coming up with a generic version themselves, because we can enjoy patent protection. And so when it is patented, we can, you know, price high. And it is quite appropriate in that regard because, especially in R&D, you know what, we typically are spending years and billions of dollars to produce this thing, so we need to try to recoup our R&D costs, right? And so that is a key thing. So yeah, in that context, skimming might be quite appropriate in that regard. So it is quite appropriate when we are not that concerned about rapidly building up market share, right? So that is a key thing. We price high, we're not that concerned about building a market share, so it's quite useful in that regard. For example, we're introducing a new advanced cancer medication. Not everybody is going to go out and buy it. It's only a very selected number of consumers that will purchase it, so we don't have to worry too much about rapidly building market share in that context. So that is a key thing. Now, having said all that, one of the cautionary things that I would suggest for skimming, and that is if we are pricing high, it can be quite attractive to the competition, because the competition will look at that and say, you know, typically, you know, they're making high margins, therefore it becomes quite attractive to the competition, and so it might stimulate market entry. So that is a key concern. However, like I said, with penetration, whenever we talk about pricing high, we never want to change price or price high or whatever without first considering the impact on that most sacred thing that we call the right. So those are some key things that we want to consider when we talk about two extreme cases of penetration or skimming. We also can, you know, use some basic financial and marketing metrics like, you know, ROS, return on sales, return on investment, et cetera, et cetera. The key thing though is that whenever we rely purely, exclusively on some of these financial metrics, we do so at the exclusion of considering the impact on consumer psychology, which, as I said, is very, very important, right? So we need to be cautious about that. Are they good? Yes. Should we use them? Yes. Should we rely on them exclusively? No, for the reason I just mentioned. So we need to be very cautious about that. Very useful, but we have to be careful about that because, like I said, it ignores the role of the consumer, the psychology of the consumer, and the role of the competition when we look purely at those metrics. So we need to be cautious about that. You know, we could also engage in what we call more competitive pricing also, you know. What is the competition doing? You know, if they are pricing like this, maybe we want to, you know, match our pricing according to the competition also, you know. Again, that's a, you know, kind of a dangerous kind of approach. If we rely on it exclusively, yes, consider it, but we want to be cautious about relying on it exclusively. But we need to recognize that. Because for numerous reasons, if we undercut the competition, we might inadvertently be drawn into a pricing war. And when we get drawn into a pricing war, we might not be able to win it. And there are ways, I think I mentioned to you in class before, there are ways, that we can fight a pricing war, but, generally speaking, we need to be very cautious about that, wording and very careful. So those are some key things that we need to be careful about. Now, I've already mentioned a few fundamental terms here. What did I say? The maximum amount the consumer is willing to pay. What do we call that? 3 terms, right? What are they again?
Perceived value, nominal
Perceived
value,
customer value,
customer
and
value,
reservation price. Right?
not means
That
price.
captures the maximum amount the consumer is willing to pay. Now, building on what you said at the front end of this session, there's another term that we want to be square in our mind, and that is, what did you say? Reference price. So we want to be very certain about what reference price is. Do not confuse, please, reference price with the aforementioned key term. Separate different things. When we talk about a reference price is that standard that exists in the mind of the consumer as to what they deem to be fair and appropriate. It is that standard against which the consumer will compare the price and determine whether it is fair and appropriate. So that is a key thing. So therefore, when we talk about reference price, the question then emerges, as marketers then, can we establish reference price in the mind of the consumer? Or do we have to sort of sit back and sort of hope for the best? Well, the answer is, what is the answer? A or B? Do we have to sit back and hope for the best, or can we affect it?
We can affect it.
Absolutely, we can lean forward and affect it. We can absolutely lean forward and clearly establish the reference price in the mind of the consumer, right? However, generally speaking, let's talk about reference price for a sec. What goes into the formulation of a reference price? Past behavior, experience in purchases, word of mouth, what other people are saying, advertising efforts, marketing efforts, existing knowledge, all that goes into the establishment of a reference price. However, notwithstanding that, as marketers, we can still, shall we say, affect and manipulate that reference price in the mind of the consumer. And how do we do it? There's an example right there of how we do it. And that is the same pictures that I used during our sessions.
Yeah.
So what are we doing here? We are establishing that reference price. We are leaning forward and establishing that reference price in the mind of the consumer by following what we talked about before. So what do we call that? What do we call that process where we, establish that reference price and discount lower? What do we call
Anchor.
that? We anchor it and readjust.
Adjust.
We anchor it higher and adjust it downward, right? And we talk all about that at the front end. And by the way, just as an aside, when we talk about anchor and adjust here, that is more than just a simple little psychological premise that we leverage in marketing. When we talk about anchor and adjust, that is a major domain and topic area in psychology. Right? As humans, we have this natural inclination to anchor something, whether it's a thought, a political belief, a value, an opinion. We anchor it in our minds, and then we compare other things to that anchor in the mind, and we can adjust accordingly. And that is a natural, hardwired human inclination to do. So when we talk about anchor and adjust in this context, we're just, flowing with natural human inclination. Right? So anchor and adjust, very, very powerful thing, this whole notion of anchor and adjust in human behavior. So we get that. Furthermore, we see some other key things here that are at play. We realize that, again, as we mentioned before, that, very, very prominent is this price-quality relationship, right? And we know that the consumer will defer to price if it is the only available piece of information that they have on the product. If all they know about that product that they're looking at is price, they will make assertions about quality based on that available information, which is only price. Okay? So if they know nothing about the product except price, they will say, that high price, gotta be high quality, or the reverse is true. So they will use price as we say, a proxy variable for quality. So absolutely, they will absolutely rely on price when there is a lack of information about quality. So that is a key thing. We also recognize that as marketers, we can leverage this whole notion of price too, if we want to enhance that perceived status and that prestige, right? Leverage prestige pricing and that kind of a thing. And we can do that quite effectively, as we do. So this is a very prominent thing, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. So that is key. We also recognize that there are what we call artificial price points, right? So artificial price points are sort of the endings of the price. So what are some examples of that? In other words, why don't we just price our final price at $60 and call it a day, instead of getting involved in this $59.99 thing? Yeah. Well, the reason why is because the consumer will look at that $59.99 and it will look and feel a whole lot cheaper in the mind of the consumer than the next highest whole number. Is it? Is there a difference between $59.99 and $60? No, there's no difference.
No
about
difference.
1 cent, no difference. But, the overall impact in the mind of the consumer is that it is perceived as being far cheaper, because there's a natural inclination in the mind of the consumer to emphasize those left-hand digits a bit more than the right-hand digits. So what do? You use those right-hand digits priced just below the next highest number. And that's why we see how pervasive, as we call it, odd-even pricing. There are a number of names for that tactic. I tend to call it odd-even pricing. We see how pervasive that is in the marketplace. And furthermore, it's used across the scale too. So yeah, you will see that chocolate bar priced at 98 cents. You won't see it generally priced at $1. Furthermore, you'll see, like we saw tools and that and other commodities priced at, $79.99 instead of $80. And furthermore, it's used across the scale. So seldom will you see that house priced at, $900,000. But you will see that same house priced at $899, $999 kind of thing, right? You won't see a house price at $1 million, but you'll see it at $999,900. So it can be used across the scale, priced just below the next highest number. So that is key, and that's what we call artificial price points. And in this case, we call it an odd ending kind of a tactic. And also there are other artificial price points that are used quite often, by major retailers that are used as a means of inventory control. So in other words, you might see prices, with an ending of 0.99. And that 0.99 for inventory purposes might depict that it is a regular price item. If you see a 0.97, that might mean that it is on discount. And if you see it at 0.93, that might depict that it has undergone several discounts and it is not subject to further discounts. right? And so we see this, and different big box retailers have their own little systems. Generally, we see that too. And that's an odd, that's a psychological price point too, right? That is used for that purpose. So we see this quite often, right? So we see that. Now, the reason why, as I mentioned to you before, the reason why we want to create that impression in the mind of the consumer that they are saving money. In other words, we want to create that perception in the mind of the consumer that their loss is being minimized, right? That's what we're saying. We said that we want to create that impression of loss minimization. And there is another psychological term, very powerful in psychology also, that's used to describe this kind of a thing in psychology. And that is the key point, the psychological concept of loss aversion. So this thinking has its roots in psychology. So loss aversion, the psychological concept of loss aversion, which states essentially that as humans, and this is hardwired into us as humans, in other words, it's not necessarily learned per se, it's hardwired into us as humans, and that is that we hate losing things. And a corollary to that is that we attend to those negative things more so than those positive things. And that's why when we're online and we do read reviews and that kind of a thing, we see that we naturally will heed those negative reviews and put more weight on the negative reviews than we do the positive things, because it's all part of loss aversion. Right? And it has its evolutionary basis, hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were living in caves and that kind of thing. We would attend to those big animals, vicious animals, negative things that have the potential of doing us harm more so than the softer, fluffy things, right? So loss aversion. So what happened in the 1970s then is Nobel laureates Tversky and Kahneman took that notion, psychological notion of loss aversion, and imported it into economics. And they developed this very elegant, highly powerful, fairly simple and straightforward theoretical perspective that they call prospect theory. And prospect theory, and again, you will not see this in the textbook, but I always teach it to my students because it's so important. Prospect theory allows us to understand the impact on the consumer of various prices, various price combinations, magnitudes of prices, and it helps us to understand the overall psychological impact of gains and losses. And so that's what prospect theory does for us. So it allows us to understand gains and losses and the respective magnitudes of those gains and losses. And that's the beauty of prospect theory. Very simple, very powerful. And here, of course, we are simplifying. So when we talk about loss aversion, prospect theory, it helps us to sort of draw it out a little bit so that we can understand it in more detail. So what does it look like? This is what it looks like. First of all, again, prospect theory, we can look at it like this. Prospect theory is depicted by a squashed S kind of a curve. And so here then we can set it up by looking at it this way. We have a loss, we have a gain. And then we also think about the overall value impact on the consumer in terms of pleasure, pain, right? And here I'm sort of simplifying the terminology just to make this one. So what do we have? We have pleasure. And we have pain. Now, I said that when we talk about prospect theory, the curve is what we call a squashed S. So it looks something like this. We have a fairly shallow curve up here, and it progressively gets more steep here. positively sloped. So what do we have? We have something like this. Nice. So that's what we have. And so to help us understand it, we recognize what prospect theory is. So what does prospect theory tell us? Prospect theory suggests that, here we go, the psychological pain associated with a loss is greater than the psychological pleasure associated with a gain of equal magnitude. I'll say that again. The psychological pain associated with a loss is greater than the psychological pleasure associated with a gain of equal magnitude. So what does that mean? That means then that if I lose $50, that loss of $50 is a lot more painful than the pleasure that I would get out of gaining $50. Right? So psychological pain associated with a loss is greater than the psychological pleasure associated with gain of equal magnitude. So let's just sort of flesh that out graphically in a little bit more detail. What did I just say? First of all, an underpinning notion here is that what we're talking about losses and gains that are equal magnitude. So if we have a magnitude of a loss, call it L here, L, loss, and we have a gain, call it G. We know that loss is equal to gain, equal magnitude, right? So then we say, okay, the psychological pain associated with a loss is how much? Well, psychological pain associated with this magnitude of loss is how much magnitude? This. So what do we have here? Let's call it delta 1. Delta 1 here is the pain associated with that loss. Got it. What about a gain of equal amount? So we have a gain of equal magnitude to the loss. How much pleasure is associated with that gain? That is the pleasure associated with that gain. Let's call it delta 2. So what are we saying here? Delta 1, the pain associated with a loss, is greater than delta 2, the pleasure associated with the gain of equal magnitude. And that essentially is the graphical depiction of what prospect theory is all about. Right? Make sense? Okay, let's pause for a second. Are there any questions on anything I've just said so far? Want me to repeat anything? So that is prospect theory. Psychological pain associated with a loss is greater than the psychological pleasure associated with a gain of an equal amount. So like I said, if I lose $50, it's a heck of a lot more painful for me than the pleasure I would get out of gaining $50. And that is depicted by prospect theory, which has essentially evolved out into economics from psychology, loss, evolution. Okay, so we see that. So what does it tell us again? Again, it really suggests then that we can frame pricing in terms of gains and losses and the psychological impact. That's a key way by which we can understand the role of price in terms of gains and losses, right? Helps us to frame it in that regard. Now, there's some other key features that we see here. We recognize that the prospect theory curve is a squashed S curve, and it looks like that. We realize everything that I've just said. Now, there's another thing here that we should hoist aboard too. What else do we see here? We see here that, here's a key point, that as gains and losses become larger in magnitude, their respective marginal, incremental impact on the consumer diminishes, right? So here, what do we have? as the gain and the loss, as they get bigger and bigger, as they get bigger and bigger, the overall effect on the consumer becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's a powerful psychological notion also. And we see that alive and well in the marketplace. And it's precisely for that reason, for example, you buy a new house for $850,000, for example, and yeah, that's kind of what you can expect to buy a new single detached house for, minimum, $850,000. The builder will say to you, okay, if you want granite, kitchen counters and this fancy wood cabinetry and the upgrade, blah, 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 it'll cost you, $55,000 more on top of your $850,000. So as a consumer, you look at that and you say, oh, okay, that's not too bad. I'm paying $50,000 more over and above the $850,000. That makes it more manageable, right? As opposed to if you just said, okay, for a kitchen it's $500,000 or $55,000 more, right? And why is that? Because in relation to those trends into that domain, that incremental amount has that lessened effect on the consumer. We see that a lot. Right? So those are some features, very powerful features associated with prospect theories that allow us to really understand how the combinations of gains and losses have that very profound psychological impact on the consumer. So yeah, that kind of bundling kind of an effect that we're talking about has that diminishing effect as it gets bigger and bigger. It also, and this is another, well, all the points I'm saying are important. It also allows us to depict then the importance of the psychological impact of paying out a sum of money. And so the notion here is that, again, whenever we experience that economic loss, it's way more pronounced than potentially getting something. So paying out is a lot more painful than getting something, right? It's a key thing. So it implies then, like I said, that what do we want to do? We want to present that price in terms of a discount. And why? Because it minimizes the loss in the mind of the consumer, and if it minimizes the loss, it minimizes the pain associated with that in the mind of the consumer. So that pain minimization is a key thing. Furthermore, when we talk about pain minimization, there is a third approach here that we want to introduce, and that is what we call mental accounting. So this is the work of Richard Thaler. Has anybody here seen that movie called The Big Short? The Big Short? Well, you might remember Selena Gomez. In The Big Short, there's a scene where she's sitting at a craps table, and there's an older professor, gray hair, knowledgeable guy that's sitting next to her. And, they're shooting craps and everything else, and the movie pauses. And then the old guy says, oh, okay, well, this is how it works, Selena. But when, this dice is rolled and there's a probability of this and a probability of that, and blah, 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 dee, da, da. And he's explaining all the theory to Selena, right? And then she says, oh, okay, got it now. And let's, that guy in that movie is Richard Thaler, by the way. Just saying. So Richard Thaler, another Nobel laureate fairly recently, also brilliant guy. And in fact, Thaler 1985, one of my favorite all-time papers. I love his work. And I love the work of Tversky and Kamen also. It's just so beautiful and elegant. It's so powerful and rich. Oh. But anyways, mental accounting. So when we talk about mental accounting or mental arithmetic, what is that all about? It helps us to understand the combinations of gains and losses in relation to how we should present them to the consumer, all with a view to minimizing that perception of loss, right? i.e. minimizing the pain. So what does that mean? That means then that if we have multiple gains, like some kind of a gain for the consumer, gain of $20, gain of $20 and a gain of $10, how should we present that series of gains to the consumer? Should we present it as a gain of $50, here you go, or do we want to present it as separate, 20 and another 20 and a 10? A or B, what do we want? We absolutely want to present it to the consumer as a series of gains. A win, another win, and another win is far more impactful in the mind of the consumer than just one big win. Okay, that's how we want to do that. Which begs the question then, according to Thaler, how do we present this kind of a scenario to the consumer when we account for magnitude, right? So what happens, gains and losses. So what happens then when we have a big loss coupled with a small gain? How do we present that to the consumer? Do we roll that small loss into a bigger gain do we roll that smaller gain into that bigger loss? Is that what I said? We're talking about a big loss, small gain. How do we present that? Do we roll that small gain into a bigger loss? Or do we parse it out and say, here's a big loss, but you're getting a small gain? How do we do it? Where do we see that scenario? Alive and well in the marketplace. Where do we see it?
Cashback.
Rebates. Rebates. You know what a rebate is? So a rebate is something like this. You walk into a store, you want to buy a washing machine that costs $500, but the salesperson would say, yeah, but you know what, right now we are having a sales promo, it's a rebate. So yeah, it costs you $500, but with a rebate, you will get $50 back. So what do we have? We have a big loss, $500, but a small gain of $50. So in other words, do we want to pursue with the preservation and the execution of the rebate, as I just described it, or do we want to just scrap all of that stuff and say $450? Which is the scenario? Well, according to mental arithmetic, as an extension of cosmic theory, according to Thaler, we want to segregate that small gain out of the larger loss, and that's what we want to do, and that minimizes the overall impact of loss on the consumer, and it gives the consumer some kind of a feel good as a result of that whole thing, and that is what he called the silver lining. And of course, and that is the psychological power behind rebates, and that's why rebates are used. And then, of course, it has some very pragmatic, practical kind of impacts here too, right? So what do you do if you're going to do it? You build in some privilege into the whole thing, so you say, okay, you're going to get back $50. What do you have to do? You have to print out this, you have to get that, you have to fill out this, do that, get it together, mail it, snail mail into us, and within 6 months, you should get a check in the mail back for $50, right? So you build on these hurdles. So what happens in reality? Most consumers will do it, they'll think about it, they'll say, oh, great, good, I'm gonna get it, let's do it, and we forget to do it, right? So it's a win-win for the company, right? Check. So rebates, that is the psychological impact and basis behind the power of rebates, very prominent. What happens then when you have multiple losses? Let's say you have a loss of $20, loss of $20, and then a loss of $10. How do we present that to the consumer in order to minimize loss or perceived loss? Minimize the pain associated with it. How do we do that? Roll it all into one or piecemeal it out?
One big.
According to Thaler, you want to roll it into one. In other words, it's less painful for the consumer to hurt once
One
big
time.
than to hurt
Small multiple
smaller
times.
successively. And we see that a lot in car buying, for example, right? You buy a vehicle, let's say you pay, $40,000 for a car, you can get 3 or 4 levels of trim at an additional cost on top of that. So $40,000 for a car, but, for another, $3,000, you can get this package of benefits. If you spend $6,000 more, you get this additional package of benefits, right? So in other words, those add-ons aren't all piecemeal. You don't pay this and that and this and that, and it's all rolled into one big package, right? And that's an example of that, it hurts less. And so we see that a lot in the marketplace in those instances. So another key thing. And so therefore, the last scenario we can think about is that scenario where you have a big gain with a smaller loss, the opposite of the rebate scenario. You have a big gain with a small loss. How do we do that? Do we pull out that small loss and say, here's a big gain for you, but you also have to pay this? What do we do there?
Add the loss into the gain.
Yeah, it's less impactful, according to mental arithmetic, less impactful if you roll in that small loss into the bigger gain. So you reduce the gain a little bit, but you make that whole loss go away. That's more powerful for the consumer. It minimizes that pain. So that is a very prominent and powerful thinking of Thaler, right? And it really is elegant, and it is really a thing of beauty, and I love it. So, what have we just said? We have just said, we've just traced out for you the theoretical development of three major elements here. We've talked about that psychological concept of loss aversion on which all of this is based. And then we said, okay, that is being extended into economics, prospect theory. And then again, within the domain of economics, that thinking is being extended into mental accounting and mental arithmetic. Three major extensions here. Right? Beautiful. It's just a thing of theoretical elegance. So we have that going on. Now, let's talk low level a little bit. Let's talk about a little bit of motherhoodish kind of stuff now. Now that we know generally, we have a good understanding, a psychological, conceptual understanding of how this stuff works, let's talk about some of the low-end tactical kind of options that we have available to us. First of all, three major approaches here. First of all is what we call price line pricing, right, generally speaking. Here we're talking about pricing within the product line. So we already talked about product bundling or price bundling, right? We talked about that at the front end. This is where we have our Costco, we have our bundled products, 3 tubes of toothpaste for one price, right? What do we call that? Price bundling. So the notion here is that the bundle price is lower than the sum of the individual prices, right? Which is attractive to the consumer. So we have that. That's an approach, that's a tactic. We also have what we call product line pricing, okay? More product line pricing. So if you look at within, a product line, for example, let's say, this is a little dated, but I'll say it anyway. Let's say, we're looking at our, for the Mac fans here, we're looking at our iPods, right? Remember years ago, within the product line of the Apple music players, right? We had our Nano, we had the Shuffle iPod, and then we had the iPod Touch, and there might have been one other one, right? Levels of products within that product line. So how did the pricing work? We had the cheapest, which is the Nano, which was about $100. And then we had the Shuffle, and then we had the iPod Touch, and then we might have had one other one, which was like hundreds and hundreds of dollars, right? So what is that? That is what we call product line pricing, where you offer the consumer different variants of the product within the product line, at different price points. Product line pricing. And then we also have complementary pricing, right? And complementary pricing is where it really applies to products that are sort of used together, and I was sort of alluding to that earlier. So in other words, if you buy my photocopy machine, I will give you a year's supply of paper at a particular price. I will throw in, or I will offer you an inclusion of a year's supply of ink at a complimentary price, and that's what we call complimentary pricing. We also have what we call more value pricing, yeah? And so here, we recognize what is value again? Tell me again, it is benefits over price. We've spoken about that, right? And so what do we have here? Like I said before, we have some tactics that are in play. One is to price at the maximum amount that the consumer is willing to pay. And that's what we call pricing the value. That's an option. May not want to do it, but it is an option. So again, we're pricing at the ceiling of the strategic price gap. Conversely, we have more penetration pricing, and penetration pricing is what, where we price low. We've spoken about that. And there's a third option here in this sort of umbrella of value pricing, and that is precisely more value pricing. And that is where we are pricing our products such that that perceived value in the mind of the consumer is maximized. Right? So you adopt that price and, you know, compare it to the benefits in order to maximize the value in the mind of the consumer. And that typically implies then pricing low, generally speaking. Or you can dramatically increase the benefits also. But essentially it's value driven, right? Think Costco, think Dollarama, think Winners, think those kind of things, right? So that brings us then to the third kind of tactic approach that we can use, and this is where we tap into CB, consumer behavior, consumer psychology, where we compare some prices to another product, right? So the pricing is, you know, adopted in relation to another price, and it is quite appropriate where we have what we call heterogeneous, heteros differences, where we have differences in consumer behavior. And that sort of comes, and I've already spoken about that, that comes by way of like price discrimination, you know, where we have differences in consumer behavior. There are some consumers that are not price sensitive at all. So they will absolutely gladly wait till the last minute to make that booking. They will absolutely go and see movies on a Saturday night. They don't care. They don't, you know, they, you know, won't go out of their way to go to see a movie on a Tuesday night, for example, or they will wait till the last minute because they don't care, right? Different prices to different consumers. So differential pricing, right? So yeah, price discrimination, like we talked about, is one approach of differential pricing. We also have another variant of that, pricing in relation to another price, differential pricing, and that is what we call second market discounting, which is quite prominent also. So second market discounting is where we sell in a secondary market, typically at a price point lower than we would in our primary market. So what would be an example of that? I will give you
Pharmacy.
in, there are sort of gray markets. That's a type of an example. We talked about that. Another one that is quite prominent in this province right here and now is electrical power. So right now in this province, we have various means of generating electricity whereby, you know, we pump electricity into the grid from sources such as solar, wind, nuclear, hydroelectric, the majority of which is hydroelectric. And so that is generated, those sources, and it all goes into the grid. So the question then becomes, okay, what do we do with electric power when it's very windy and very sunny, and we have a surplus of this kind of power? How do we deal with that? Well, the way that we deal with that is that we will capitalize on what I just said, which is sell excess power into a secondary market. And so generally, how does that work? Well, you know, most of the the cost associated with developing power, like I said, comes out to generally being about 13, 14, 15, 16 cents per kilowatt hour, right? And so what happens? You can't store it. So what does Hydro Ontario do? Hydro One, they sell it to upstate New York and other secondary markets, discount, second market discount. So they will sell that electricity for about 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Yeah, you take a loss essentially on it, but it's better than letting it evaporate, so to speak. And so what is that? That is what we call second market discount. We can also, engage in what we call periodic discounting. And what is periodic discounting? That is where we basically put stuff on sale for a period of time. Periodic discounting. Canadian Tire does that. We talked about this before. Canadian Tire does that all the time. Every week they have a segment of their inventory that is periodically discounted, right? Periodic discounting. So very, used a lot in retail, right? Stuff goes on sale, so to speak, right? Does Tim Hortons use periodic discounting? Never. No, that's just not their model. That's not the strategy. Okay, and then we have, and we've alluded to this before, we're sort of putting a point on it. This whole notion then of differential pricing, where we have like a flat rate versus a variable rate, right? So when you get cell coverage or internet coverage, you can have a flat rate, or you can have different tiers, again, based on consumption, metering, like I talked about, or you can basically have an unlimited, so have an unlimited pricing versus another baseline price, right? Differential pricing, that's another tactical option, right? So we have all these tactical options that are based on that notion of differential pricing, as I mentioned. So, as we wind down, before we just revisit this notion of price quality again, I want to spend a minute just talking about the legal implications here of everything that I've said. Now, in this country, we have a major federal regulatory framework that we call the Canada Competition Act. And that outlines in detail from a legal perspective what companies can and cannot do legally with respect to pricing and other forms of competition. So there are a few things that I want to make you aware of that are very important to know, so I urge you to know them, that have very important legal implications. And the first thing that I want to tell you about is what we call price fixing. Price fixing, you've heard this term. What is price fixing? Price fixing simply is this. It is a conspiracy among firms where firms will collude and get together in order to do what? Set a price.
Set a price.
Yeah. So when you go down and you see in an area that all the gas is all the same thing, proving it is one thing in a court of law,
Yeah.
knowing it kind of happens is a different thing, okay? Here we're just talking about legal perspective. It basically points to collusion, price fixing, right? And some firms, they get caught sometimes, they're colluding with each other in order to fix the price. So, price fixing, illegal, not allowed to do that. We have what we call deceptive pricing, which is another illegal kind of a thing, deceptive pricing. And that is where pricing is established with a view to deceiving consumers. So you can establish a price, for example, and then there are different tactics that are used, like a bait and switch kind of a thing. So you think you're going to pay $1,500 for that couch, but in actual fact, at the checkout, they say, oh yeah, no, we're just kidding. It's actually $2,500, right? Bait and switch kind of a thing. We see that a lot too sometimes. But again, proving it and experiencing it are often two different things. So, deceptive pricing. And the last kind of pricing violation against the law that I would like to talk about is what we call, and this is important too, predatory pricing. Predatory pricing. And predatory pricing is the practice of charging a very low price with a view to driving the competition out of business. That's what predatory pricing is all about. So in other words, Irving Oil, a number of years ago, they went to court, they lost, and it was proven that they engaged in predatory pricing. So what did they do? In New Brunswick, a province of this country, they set up some gas stations in an area of that province. They deliberately priced low to undercut the competition. The other smaller players, they couldn't compete against the big boy. They just went out of business because they couldn't compete. And what was that? That was predatory pricing. All right, so those are three legal kind of aspects that we want to be well aware of. Now, as we sum up then, let us end off by yet again talking a little bit about the price-quality relationship. So ultimately, when we talk about price-quality relationship, lest you think that I'm making this stuff up, I assure you I am not. This comes squarely out of the literature and the empirical research, most notably the work of Ericsson and Johansson in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s. And these guys did amazing work in this domain. Fundamentally, they suggested that, consistent with everything that we are talking about, that price is what it is fundamentally a constraint. In other words, the higher the price represents a potential expenditure, an economic loss, and so therefore when you are spending money on something, it's a constraint in that you have less money to spend on something else. So price really represents some kind of a constraint like that, right? So that's key to realize. We also recognize, and we've spoken about this before, that price absolutely is a proxy variable in the mind of the consumer for quality. It's that mental shortcut that we talked about. And by the way, what do we call a mental shortcut? Like price quality is heuristic. Exactly. Very prominent heuristic. Furthermore, we also recognize, really stemming out of these guys, that the perception of price is very important, as well as the actual price, because it has repercussions on how people think, how they feel, and how those prices affect them psychologically. So that is key. Furthermore, we also realize that not only does that price-quality relationship work in the direction that we just talked about, in other words, high price, high quality, got it, but it also has the reciprocal kind of an effect also. So if the consumer just sees high quality without any reference to price, they will think high price in response to that high perceived quality. So that price-quality relationship is so powerful that it works in a reciprocal manner also, which is quite powerful. Again, that comes out of the work of Ericsson and Johansson. And then lastly, like I said, it is such a powerful thing that, if we want to measure from a research, if we want to measure perceived quality, we can even use price as a proxy variable, an indirect way of measuring perceived quality, because there's such a strong correlation between the two. And so that is very powerful. So, therefore, we recognize then that, perceptions of price are critically important. We recognize that there's a lot to pricing. We recognize that ultimately pricing is an exercise in consumer psychology. Here's an important point too. We recognize that when we look at price, that number of price, not only is that price critically important, but the way by which it is presented to the consumer is just as important, if not more important, than the actual price itself. The way that it's presented to the consumer, because of all these psychological aspects that we are talking about. So we realize that. So the point here is that I would argue, here's a key point, that just that price is probably one of the most information-packed constructs that we as marketers deal with, right? Just that price is so information-laden It's one of the most information value laden constructs that we deal with, right? So just that price has a huge impact on consumer thinking and their behavior and how they feel, which should be readily apparent to you now. Absolutely, at the end of the day, it is integrally tied to our financial well-being and our ability to enhance profit. So it is key. Right. So are there any questions on anything we spoke about? No? Okay, so that is pricing. A lot to it, eh? It is fascinating, impactful, I think. Okay, so have a good day, everyone.